area called Galatia, which is now what you might call Turkey. It was called Asia Minor at that day. It's not up there. I can't point it out to you, although maybe I'll be able to. Here we go. So Galatia is up here, as you can see. This is Israel down here. There's Jerusalem, Damascus. Remember the road to Damascus? That was Paul traveling there. And he was around here in Antioch for a time. But Galatia is a larger area, and it's called Asia Minor now, as you can see. And here's Colossae, where Colossians is written to, Ephesus, Ephesians, Iconium, etc., etc. And this was the calling on Rav Shaul's life to be what's called the messenger, or the sent one, or apostle to the Gentiles in this land. He was one of the greatest servants of Yeshua in history, and he literally gave his life for his Lord, for the master, the rabbi that he served. Of great concern to Paul were the people in this area called Galatia. Particularly, it's called Asia Minor now, or Turkey. It's all sort of mixed together. But God called him, remember, to be the one sent to the Gentiles, even though he was an observant, religious Jew. He did his job, traveling to nearly every part of the ancient world. But I ask you a question. If he was a Jew called to be a student of God's Torah and traditions of the people, why would he be so zealous about reaching the Gentiles? And the answer is very simple. That was his calling. He may not have liked it too much. I imagine in Galatia they didn't have too much Jewish food, probably not a lot of Jews there to hang out with, not a lot of Torah schools to study from, but it was his calling. So it's something to keep in mind, because each one of us, not only does God know the hairs on each one of our heads, he knows our calling. Each one of us has a calling, a calling of service to the Lord, and it's important to remember what it is, because you remember that great singer, famous singer, Bob Dylan. Anybody remember Bob Dylan? Some of you younger people go, who? You know. But Bob Dylan wrote a song in his days as a believer, which I know he was for a time, and it was called either you have to serve the devil or you serve the Lord. One of the other. You have to make a choice. And I know we all would admit that serving the Lord is better than serving the devil. Am I right? But what does that mean to serve the Lord? It's different for each one of us. But it's important for us to find out how God calls us to serve him. So let's look at this last section of Galatians this morning. What scholars call Paul or Shaul's signature is Galatians 6, starting at verse 11. And he's been teaching us all along how to behave in a community of believers, particularly, and this one especially is important. So Galatians 6, verse 11, and if you have a complete Jewish Bible or a complete Jewish study Bible, which is what we use in this congregation, you'll see that Dr. Stern chose to put the letters here in italics. He wanted to make the point that what Paul says was. So Paul says, by the way, this signature is common to Paul. He always ended his letters like he signed the document. Hey, this is from Paul. But it's also the summation of his main point that he wanted his friends in Galatia to understand, and that is that even though elsewhere in the Torah, he states that it is holy, just, and good, and that he followed the Torah and the traditions of the people his whole life. Nothing wrong with following the Torah at all, but he wanted to make the point to them that it's not necessary for salvation. Not necessary for salvation. Their connection with God was not based on the Torah, it was based on Yeshua's sacrifice. And they were getting confused. They were getting confused. And that happens often in the Messianic movement, because I'll share some things about that a little later. But as I like to say, salvation and sanctification are two different things. Don't get confused. Salvation is a one-time event, that happens because God chooses to save us. He chooses to reveal to us his salvation in Yeshua's sacrifice. It's a one-time event, but sanctification is a process. It's a process of growth. And the way to grow is by the Spirit of God teaching us what God's Word says and imparting that, and bringing that into our lives. So keep that in mind. There's a difference between salvation and sanctification. I'll mention that again. Now let's explore the closing of Paul's letter to the Galatians. Verse 11 says, "Look at the large letters I use as I close in my own handwriting." He wanted to make sure everybody knew he wrote this himself. It wasn't his amanuensis, which is like a secretary. He himself wrote this letter to the people in Galatia. And he wanted to make that very clear to them so they would listen and read carefully. Now, in today's world, somebody once said, what would people do if they were sending an email? You would put it in bold, right? Or caps and underline it and make it italics and you maybe make it a little larger to make the point. Look at this. Check out what I'm saying. You know, you get these appeal letters at the end of the year. They underline the most important things for you to look at. So here Rav Shaul was saying, look at the large letters I use as I close in my own handwriting. He wanted people to see what he had to say here. It's important. Now, Paul said that it was not necessary to keep the Torah to be saved, despite some people who had come to the area teaching that. They were teaching to Gentile believers who had come to faith in the Messiah that they now had to add keeping the Torah to their spiritual lives. Some people call those Judaizers, which I think is a horribly pejorative expression, the Judaizers. They were people that were forcing and suggesting and urging people to start practicing Torah. Another writer calls these the influencers, which is kind of a nice expression. Well, who were these people and why were they doing it? Why were they telling the Gentile believers in Galatia who had recently come to faith that now they had to keep the Torah? It's a good question. Why were they doing this? They were heaping laws and traditions upon the people of Israel, the people of Galatia, and these were relatively new believers. And to tell you, it's tough enough to begin something new, isn't it? Let alone to have the whole package laid in your lap. It has to do with fishing. Now, frankly, I don't fish. Where's John? John and Rusty are our resident fishermen. They'll correct me if I'm wrong. But there's some basic fundamentals of fishing, and I know those. For example, get some bait, the thing that attracts the fish. Put it on a hook, the thing that catches the fish, and throw it in the water. Those are the fundamentals of fishing, right, John? But there are a lot of nuances that a good fisherman knows. Rusty was here last week. He was telling me that he lives in Jacksonville now on the ocean side. There's places to fish all over the place. But he drove all the way across Florida from Jacksonville all the way to the other side of Florida because it was a very special place to fish. And he showed me a photo of himself standing there with an old friend of ours both with more fish than you can know what to do with. I don't know what people do with 40 fish when they catch them. But anyway, if you know what you're doing, you can catch more fish. The fundamentals are great, but there's more to it. That's kind of a way to look at this. The fundamentals of being a believer are salvation by grace through faith in Yeshua, but the maturing part, the sanctification, comes when we learn more. I don't plan to go fishing. John asked me every year, you want to go fishing again? I said, no, I don't think so. Last time we went fishing, he rented a little fishing boat, and there were like 6 guys on the boat, including myself. We had to get up real early in the morning to go out in the Chesapeake Bay, and we caught 1 fish. And we divided it up, I think, in 6 or different ways. It was great when I got it home, but there wasn't much of it. So I'd rather go to a fish market, I think. Anyway, maybe I'll go fishing with you again. These new believers needed to know that their salvation was secure based on trusting Yeshua, period. But Yeshua's sacrificial love is what got them saved. Paul, Shaul, in Hebrew, their loving teacher, wanted them to understand that fact. So why would these other people, here's the question, why would these other people come and mess them up? Perhaps they needed some time to let their newfound faith season for a season. Kind of like sink in their lives. So why would these other people put pressure on them? Now remember, this is Paul's conclusion of his whole letter. Verse 12 tells us, it is those who want to look good outwardly who are trying to get you to be circumcised. Circumcision is not something I'm going to talk about this morning, but if you don't know what it is, ask somebody. It's a ceremony on an 8-day-old Jewish baby boy that uses a little bit of a knife thing, and the next thing you know, there's some blood, and then the person becomes part of the people of Israel. It's a very wonderful ceremony, and I've never performed it, but I've supervised many of them. And circumcision was a good deal, and it meant entrance into the people of God. A person who was circumcised as an adult was saying, I now will follow the Torah. I now will follow the ways of God. So he says, it is those who want to look good outwardly who are trying to put this on people. The only reason they're doing it, though, is to escape persecution for preaching about the Messiah's execution state. That may be a little confusing. Let me explain what that means. Verse 12. They wanted to influence these new Gentile God-fearers to become proselytes or convert to Judaism of the day. Full conversion. So they would look good among the other Jewish people in their community. Otherwise, they might be persecuted by the enemies of Messiah, because the enemies of Messiah, in this case, were many of the Jewish people who really rejected him. They were afraid they would be persecuted because they were winning people to the Lord and then making them Jews. So there was an issue of numbers, potential, I would say, physical, fleshly competition taking place because the numbers of these Messianic groups was growing because of Gentile involvement in them. It wasn't Yeshua the other people were against so much. That's never been the case. They were concerned about Jewish survival and wanted to see the number of observant Jews growing. Probably these folks that were putting the pressure on had been circumcised and become fully Jewish, and they wanted everybody else to do this now. It's sort of like how people get when they find a new diet. It's pretty obnoxious, and I confess I've done it myself. You find a new diet that's working, and then everybody you know who's overweight, you want to tell them about your new diet. How many of you done that? Oh, seriously? Oh, now you're getting honest. Okay. A lot of people do that because we want to share it and we want to be celebrating, and so we tell everybody about our newfound diet. I'm not going to tell you about mine. It has to do with macrobiotics, not calories, but. Or it's like when somebody joins a fraternity or a sorority. They want everybody to join. They want it because it's the best one around. It's when somebody's a new anything, typically they get very excited about. They want everybody to be involved in that. They want people to sign up. So these zealous new Gentile believers who had become proselytes wanted the other Gentiles who were coming to faith to also become Jews. They wanted the Jewish community to feel really good about their work, not threatened by it. When we moved to Clarksville about 15 years ago, and we built this building in conjunction with a few churches, we were not popular with our own people. The week we moved in here, there were several letters from rabbis in this community against me and against the congregation. They didn't even know me, and the congregation hadn't even moved yet, but they write these letters to the editor against us. Why? Fear. They were afraid we would be so effective evangelistically that all the Jewish people would end up in this room and not in their synagogues, or that Jewish people would get confused and follow Yeshua, not the Messiah they're waiting for, whoever that might be. So they made it difficult for us to be accepted in the Jewish world in Howard County. I don't know if you know that. So what was said about me, you wouldn't believe in the letters to the editor in the newspaper. It was funny because it wasn't true, but that's what they thought. When God arranged for us to have this gathering place, a place to worship, it was a problem for many in the Jewish community. I think Messianic Judaism is the best form of Judaism there is, and it is a form of Judaism. I think it's better than Hasidic Judaism, Orthodox Judaism, conservative, reform, reconstructionist, secular Judaism, humanistic Judaism. I think Messianic Judaism has it all because we have the Messiah and we have the entire Torah to put the Messiah in. The context is there. So I think we're the best form of Judaism. For those who are watching on television, come check us out. Maybe you'll find that out yourself. But we don't evangelize aggressively. That's what they were afraid we would do. So they said negative things to make their people nervous about talking to me or talking to any of the members of the congregation, because they would thought we would be evangelizing them, whatever that may mean in their mind. It was not what we were doing. We like to communicate about the Messiah, right? And that's a calling of every believer. We give a testimony, a witness of our relationship with Hashem through Messiah. But that's not what we were doing. But that's what they were afraid of. So the influencers wanted to get these new Messianic Gentiles to become Messianic Jews to please the religious Jews of their day. Perhaps it was a matter of numbers. Maybe they thought that they didn't want to lose some of their numbers. I don't know. Anyway, verse 13 kind of helps us understand what's going on. For even those who are getting circumcised don't observe the Torah. On the contrary, they want you to get circumcised so that they can boast of having gained your adherence. He's telling the truth. There were many people who were going through the circumcision ceremony and then saying, well, that's it. I've done what I need to do. No more keeping kosher, no more keeping Shabbat, no more observing the holidays. I got circumcised. It's enough. A lot of Christians understand that because they say, well, I've been born again. I was born again, which is a term that needs to be unpacked a bit. I was born again. Now I don't have to do anything. I'm saved. I can behave any way I want. These are not mature ways of looking at the Bible and looking at God. So a person who got circumcised, apparently these days, a lot of them were getting circumcised to show off, like, they were one of the people, but they weren't doing anything about it. So Paul is kind of castigating them for this behavior. On the contrary, they want you to get circumcised. Why? So that they can boast of having gained your adherence. He didn't say they want you to get circumcised so you can learn how to be better sanctified and grow in the Lord and mature. No, he sees in them the reason that they got circumcised was so they could get brownie points with the other Jewish people. He spoke about this in Romans. Let me read this section from Romans to you. But if you call yourself a Jew and rest on the Torah and boast about God and know his will and give your approval to what is right because you're instructed in the Torah, and if you have been persuaded yourself that you are to guide the blind and bring light to those in darkness, that you're an instructor for the spiritually unaware and the teacher of the children. He's speaking about a Jew who's trying to share with Gentiles in Romans there. And then you teach others, and you don't teach yourself. You preach, thou shalt not steal, but you steal. You preach, don't commit adultery, but you commit adultery. You preach detesting idols, yet you have idolatrous acts in your lives. You who take pride in the Torah, do you, by disobeying the Torah, also dishonor God. As it says in the Tanakh, for it is because of you that God's name is blasphemed among the Gentiles. For circumcision is indeed, listen, is indeed of value if you do what the Torah says. But if you are a transgressor of the Torah, your circumcision has become uncircumcision. Now that's poetry. A person who is circumcised can't get uncircumcised. What it means is that the things that would come along with being circumcised, like all the ways to follow God, it's like worthless. It's as if you didn't get circumcised. You've got to be really careful when you read certain things and make sure you got the understanding. So it seems here that Paul was saying it's more about following the other ways of God than just a little surgical operation. To him, it was more important that a person follow the ways of God rather than just be circumcised. Circumcision was the beginning of an entrance into the Jewish world, not the end. It was the beginning. Just like being born again is the beginning of a spiritual walk, not the end. We still have a lot of work to do, a lot of growth to accomplish. So like I said, their motives weren't quite pure. Perhaps they were looking for some Gentile notches on their belts, if you could say it like that. They wanted to have, we have a lot of converts to Judaism. And they would say, and then the Jewish people would say, very good job. But that's not the reason that they should preach this. However, Paul wants his friends to understand that there's something above all this that's more important. He says here in verse 14, "But as for me, heaven forbid that I should boast about anything like circumcision, except the execution stake or the cross of our Lord Yeshua the Messiah. Through him, as far as I am concerned, the world has been put to death on the stake, and through him, as far as the world is concerned, I have been put to death on the stake. For neither being circumcised nor being uncircumcised matters. What matters is being a new creation." He was not saying that circumcision was unimportant, but compared to being a new creation, it was. Regarding fully standing with God, being a new creation is what counts. Again, though, this was not saying that circumcision was less important. He's just saying that they're both important for different reasons. That's a very important point to get, because historically the church has said if you get circumcised, it's wrong. So they've told Jewish believers who have children, don't circumcise them, because here Paul says it's not important. No, it is important. It's a commandment. But what's more important is to become a new creation, a child of God. So in verse 16 he says, "As many as order their lives by this rule, shalom upon them and mercy and upon the Israel of God." Now, who is the Israel of God? Who is the Israel of God? Remember, he's explaining to these Gentiles the importance of following the ways of God, even though they were not actually Jewish. They had to live by that rule that accepted people that were different from them. The Jews and the Gentiles had to accept one another. Keep in mind, this section of his letter to the Galatians is the practical advice. He reminds them of the importance of understanding the principle of unity without uniformity. It's important in congregational life. I like when I look around our congregation, I see people with different skin tones, some with more hair, some with less hair, some Asian people. I like seeing that because I think that's the nature of the body of the Messiah. So he said, if you're like that, you'd be blessed with shalom if you follow that rule. For only if they were actually following God's ways would they be set apart, would they be sanctified, either by God-fearers, either for God-fearers or full proselytes to Judaism. Either way, they still had to follow God's ways. Those are the people of God, the Israel of God. Now, the early church was great in that it helped launch the spread of the gospel, but it was not so great in certain ways dealing with the Jewish people. The early church misconstrued this verse. Here's a quote from a famous debate in the early centuries from a Christian leader named Justin Martyr. Maybe some of you have heard of him. He had a debate with a Jew named Trypho. It's recorded. Justin Martyr, again, was a believer, a leader in the church, and he had a debate with a Jewish guy named Trypho. He says this, "For we who have been led to God through this crucified Christ are the true spiritual Israel and descendants of Judah, Jacob, Isaac, and Abraham." That's in one of their discussions. This is the sort of misunderstanding that has led to replacement theology, where the church has replaced the Jews as the chosen people and has perverted God's teaching. Believe it or not, replacement theology, which is rising up again in many places, I don't want to go into it too much right now, but it began many years ago through a lot of the teaching of these early church fathers, and even Martin Luther and John Calvin, who were theological giants in those days, taught this concept of replacement theology. And guess what it led to? The Nazi Holocaust.
Yes.
6 million Jews were killed, at least in part, because this church bought this idea of replacement theology. They read in the Torah that the Jews were the chosen people, but they misread in the Brit Hadashah, the New Testament, that got changed, and now the church was the chosen people because the church is the new Israel. Not true. Or the spiritual Israel. So we have to remember that there's a real reason to understand the Bible the way it's meant to be. Paul was not saying that the church replaced Israel and that Christians replaced Jews. To Paul, Gentile followers of the Jewish Messiah had come to be a part of greater Israel, just as were the many Gentiles of old. Can you think of a few Gentiles of old that were part of the people of Israel? Think of a prostitute named Rahab, a Gentile. Think of a king named King Cyrus of Persia, who kind of became part of the people by supporting what we were doing, sending us back to Israel. Think of Cornelius, a Roman centurion, who gave money to the local synagogue to help it get built. There have been many Gentiles through history who have really been sort of part of the commonwealth of Israel. Paul made it clear that Gentile believers are children of Israel, children of God by faith, the same faith Abraham had. That was the only way to become a child of God, and Paul was in favor of that. But he made a distinction, and some of you don't like hearing this, but there's still a distinction between Jews and Gentiles. I mean, some people don't want me to say that, but it's the way the Bible reads, so I'm going to tell you the truth. Paul made it clear that Gentile believers may be children of faith as Abraham was, but they were not Jews. In Romans 11, he speaks of Gentiles as grafted in Gentiles. And he calls them a wild olive branch. He never calls them natural branches. Even though they become grafted in and become one tree, Jewish, Gentile, the Gentile branches were never called the natural branches. They were always called wild olive branches. You all look very civilized to me, you that are Gentiles. You don't look wild at all. I'm glad that we're together. I'm glad you're not wild anymore. In Ephesians 2, Paul speaks of Gentiles as fellow heirs with the Jews in what's called the Commonwealth of Israel, but he stops short of calling them Jews. And in 1 Corinthians 10:18, he uses the expression, Israel according to the flesh. What do you think that means? You have to translate the King James language, Israel in the natural born Jew. That's what it means. Israel in the flesh, the native born or naturally born Jew, is part of physical Israel, as distinct from the fellow Gentile believers that were all part of the Commonwealth of Israel. So the Commonwealth of Israel is bigger than just the Jewish people. The Commonwealth of Israel includes all of you that are Gentiles. You're not Jews unless you go through the process and become proselytes or converts, but you're part of the Commonwealth of Israel. Verse 17, from now on, I don't want anyone to give me any more tsuris. Well, that's how David Stern translated the word troubles in English. Tsuris is a Yiddish word, and it means troubles. I did tell David when I helped him redo this Bible, I've published the Complete Jewish Bible with David Stern, and we got so many complaints about the Yiddish. I said, let's get rid of the Yiddish. Let's get rid of words like shlomio or tsuris. There was even a word mamzer, which means bastard. I said, we don't have to have Yiddish. It's tough enough for people to understand the Bible, let alone put Yiddish words in there. So I'm going to translate this differently. From now on, Paul says, I don't want anyone to give me any more troubles because I have scars on my body to prove that I belong to Yeshua. In other words, give me a break, folks. I've suffered enough. The word scars is stigmata. Stigmata is a Greek word, and it means scars or brands or marks. He's saying, I've suffered enough. I've got plenty of wounds to show you. He was beaten, Paul. He was beaten and he was wounded by those who were against what he was doing. Sometimes it's the cost of discipleship. Paul experienced plenty of wounds and scars or stigmata, signs on his body, physically on his body, because of his service to the Messiah. Question for you. Which one of us is willing to experience wounds on our bodies in order to proclaim the good news of the Messiah? I want you to think about that. Now, chances are we're never going to suffer like many people do today. But some of our brothers and sisters, particularly overseas, are killed because of their faith. This happens in China, it's happened in Africa, it's happened in other places in the world. Sometimes, if you go back to the first century, remember all the way the Romans had fun was to have these, in a Colosseum, they would bring people in and they would have to fight lions and all that kind of stuff. You know, those people were mostly Messianic Jews. They were the early believers, and they were gathered up by the Romans. Let's have some fun, and let's not watch the Ravens play football. Let's just watch some of these Messianic Jews get eaten by lions. Chances are it's never going to happen to us. But we have to understand that to suffer for the Messiah is just the way it goes. It's what we have to remember, that's our calling as well. And we need to prepare for this. So I suggest that what we can do right now, just like Paul said, don't give me more troubles. I got enough scars on my body already. Let's not give each other troubles, okay? Nobody's going to persecute you here in this congregation. But let's do what we can. Instead of giving each other trouble, let's lift each other up by loving one another as Messiah loved us, sacrificing himself to atone for our sins. So the next time you're upset with somebody in the congregation or your family or your community, think about the way Paul understood suffering. He didn't want any more of it, but it was part of being one who is called to serve God. So then we come to verse 18, the conclusion of this whole letter. I'm going to sum up in a second. Paul concludes, as he does very much most of his letters. He says, the grace of the Lord Yeshua the Messiah be with your spirit, brothers. Amen. This is the customary closing for Paul. It's a benediction. And even amid their discussion of how the Torah played into their lives as Jews or Gentiles, Paul brings his readers, his hearers, all the way back to the essence of the gospel. The essence of the gospel is God's great mercy and forgiveness. So he closes, the grace of the Lord Yeshua be with you. Let me sum up the whole book right now, because we're not going to continue Galatians. The first two chapters of Galatians I shared was more of a biographical sketch about Paul, establishing his apostolic credibility. There we learned that he was called to this work, even though he wasn't the first 12 apostles. He was added later on, but he had full apostolic authority. The next few chapters are more theological, where we learn that Paul made people understand that you did not have to keep the Torah to be saved. He emphasized that throughout the third and the fourth chapter. They didn't have to do that to be super saved. Remember, keeping the Torah is not about salvation. It's about sanctification. Following God's Torah, God's law, God's commandments, whatever you want to call them, God's instruction manual is really what it is. is not about being saved. It's being sanctified, being set apart, being made more holy unto God. And then the final 2 chapters are where he explains to everybody more practical ways for believers to get along with one another, Jews and Gentiles together. So Paul's summation, once again, is that Gentiles don't have to keep the Torah to be saved or even to be super saved. But if a Gentile wants to learn the ways of the Lord, perhaps as a result of being saved, it is important that he or she learns the Torah, which is why we teach the Torah at Emmanuel. It's to help people that are saved learn how to grow in the Lord and have a greater experience with him. So we invite anybody watching on live streaming or on recorded, to whether you be a Jewish person or a Christian person, to join us here at Emmanuel, where we study the New Covenant, the Brit Hadashah, through Jewish eyes, so we understand the entire background and context of the words of the Messiah and his followers. And for the folks here at Emmanuel, you guys that are sitting here, I'm open to receiving your suggestions on the next book or series of studies that we should embark on. We're going to stick with Aleph Beta, Rabbi Foreman's teaching on the Torah, because there's very little better teaching around on the Torah, and he does a good job of even making application to our lives as he did this morning. I'm really glad to know that, like the stars, he sees them, and like us, he knows our names. Isn't that great? I love the name that my father and mother gave me without knowing anything about that. They gave me the Hebrew name, Baruch. What does that name mean? Baruch, blessed. They just named me after one of my relatives that had deceased, the Jewish tradition. But over the years, as I became a believer, and I've grown as a believer, I realized that I should change my name to Baruch, because God has given me great blessings in the Messiah. So we're going to stick with Aleph Beta, but I will probably start teaching something new in 2 weeks, and I want to get from you guys suggestions of what book we should study, or maybe series of sermons that you'd like to hear, and I can start working on that. Today, right after services, I have to fly to Nashville. There was a tragedy in my family. My first cousin's oldest son committed suicide this week. So I need to get down there as fast as possible and kind of try to bring some comfort to the family. So I'll be zipping out of here right after services. Thankfully, Joseph said he would take me to the airport. And next week, and then I'm taking my annual pilgrimage to Florida to visit my mother. It's